Let's skip back a bit to September 1960.
In New York for the General Assembly session was the greatest gathering of world leaders in modern times, all vying for the friendship and support of the new African states. One of the most fateful of many informal meetings in New York was that of Khrushchev and Castro, whose threat to Western Hemisphere solidarity was background for Ike's talks with Pan-American leaders.
In September of 1960, Fidel Castro touched down in New York City. He was there to participate in the upcoming United Nations General Assembly. The U.S. government, which was less than 4 months away from severing all diplomatic ties with Cuba, gave Fidel tight restrictions on where he was and was not allowed to go. Secretary of State Christian Herter instructed him not to leave the island of Manhattan. Of course, a year before, when Fidel had showed up in the U.S., he had been a TV sensation, and the public was actually quite enamored and curious about the bearded freedom fighter they had read about in the paper. But a lot had happened since then, as we've described. All through 1959 and 1960, the American press and American politicians had demonized the Cuban Revolution and Fidel Castro personally. For many, he was now persona non grata. The tabloids called him, quote, El Beardo, and, quote, a spoiled brat. Barry Goldwater described Castro as, quote, a bum without a shave. Long Islanders literally burned him in effigy, which is perhaps the greatest testament yet to his character. Aides recalled that this time around, unlike the year before, as people watched his motorcade drive by in New York City, they were not cheering. But this is not to say his admirers did not show up. In fact, 3,000 people waited for Castro on the rainy day that his plane landed. But when he tried to get out of his car to greet the crowd on the other side of the fence, police officers used nightsticks to beat the people, and they prevented Castro from even leaving his car.
About a day after arriving in New York, and after some lurid press reports alleging that Castro's crew was killing chickens and cooking moldy steaks in the ritzy Shelburne Hotel, on the east side, the Cubans ended up making other arrangements, cementing the legend of Fidel's visit in 1960.
This would be the moment that Fidel and the Cuban delegation checked into the Hotel Teresa in Harlem.
Raul Roa Corey was the junior-most member of Cuba's permanent delegation to the UN at the time. In an interview with us, Roa explained how he had heard about the possibility of putting Fidel and the Cubans up in Harlem. When the Cuban delegation had arrived in New York, as we mentioned, they were told to restrict their movements to Manhattan. Prior to Fidel's arrival, Raul Roa Corey and his Cuban UN colleagues discussed what hotel Fidel and the delegation should check into. The Waldorf Astoria was mentioned as a possibility, but most of the group dismissed it, as it had been where Batista himself stayed. The group ultimately settled on putting Fidel and his crew up at the Shelburne Hotel in Murray Hill, which was both close to the UN and easier to secure. But they didn't stay at the Shelburne Hotel for very long. Here's how Raul tells the story.
At the time, I was in charge of relations with U.S. organizations and intellectuals and people who were sympathizers of the revolution, and therefore I got a message through Bob Tabor, who was a CBS reporter.
And a member and founder of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, yes?
Yes, and through him, Malcolm X told us that there was this Hotel Teresa in Harlem, which was at Fidel's disposal.
But before Raul could suggest the Teresa after this offer by Malcolm X, the delegation had decided on the Shelburne, and Fidel made his way there. But eventually, the manager of the Shelburne came to bother Raul by demanding a conspicuously large deposit.
The hotel manager told me that he wanted to see Fidel, and I told Fidel that the manager wanted to see him, and he said, no, you go talk to him and see what he wants. So I went, and he said that he wanted a $20,000 deposit.
The manager wanted a $20,000 deposit.
So when I told Fidel that this guy wanted $20,000 deposit, he says, he is a bandit. You go and tell him he's a bandit, and we're leaving this hotel.
What were his exact words in Spanish? Do you remember?
Dile que es un bandido. And I told him, as a matter of fact.
You passed on the exact words.
I used the exact words, and I told him the Prime Minister says that you're a bandit and that he is leaving the hotel and he will not make any deposit.
Known in its glory days as the Waldorf of Harlem, by the fall of 1960, Hotel Teresa was perhaps past its prime. But given the raucous reception that Fidel and his entourage immediately received upon their arrival uptown, that didn't matter one bit.
Fidel's Harlem Shuffle, as black activists and intellectuals would call it, quickly brought people into the streets. Maya Angelou, who was then 32 years old, was at the scene that day. And here's how she later described it after learning of Castro's move uptown from a Fair Play Committee member. In moments, we were on the street in the rain, finding cabs or private cars or heading for subways. We were going to welcome the Cubans to Harlem. To our amazement, at 11 o'clock on a Monday evening, we were unable to get close to the hotel. Thousands of people filled the sidewalks and intersections, and police had cordoned off the main and side streets. I hovered with my friends on the edges of the crowd, enjoying the Spanish songs, the screams of Viva Castro, and the sounds of conga drums being played nearby in the damp night air. Juan Almeida, a senior Afro-Cuban rebel commander, crowds chanted his name and asked him to come out of the hotel. Historian and activist Rosemary Mealy would put together a book about Fidel's trip, compiling many testimonials. Among them was Sarah E. Wright, late black radical feminist and novelist, who said of this celebration and chanting, "But these were not Cubans. These were my people, the poor, the abused, the disinherited, the trampled leavings of this country, offering their protection and love to the leader of another poor, abused, and disinherited people." The streets were packed, but the crowd kept going, bringing light and warmth to a dark September night, bringing light and warmth into the bleakness of their own lives. Hundreds of heavily armed police tried to do their intimidating thing. The people did not even notice them. We spoke with Bill Fletcher Jr., labor activist and former director of Trans-Africa Forum, about the significance of Fidel's trip to Harlem.
The Cuban Revolution was then viewed by so many people, including the Black Americans. This is a revolution. This is a breakthrough. And there was a great deal of excitement about the Cubans being in Harlem. Harlem was the capital of Black America politically, and some would argue culturally. But in 1960, it was clearly the capital of Black America. So it was something that to this day, I think, shocks many people.
The first of the many illustrious guests Fidel would receive at the Hotel Teresa, and in fact, the person who got him into the Teresa, was Malcolm X. Even through the language barrier, Fidel made a striking impression on Malcolm X, who later told a journalist that Fidel was, quote, "the only white person that I have really liked." There was an article about their meeting in the New York Citizen Call, written by black journalist Ralph Matthews. Malcolm X told Fidel, quote, "Downtown for you, it was ice. Uptown is warm." The premier smiled appreciatively. "Yes, we feel very warm here." Then the Muslim leader, ever a militant, said, "I think you will find the people in Harlem are not so addicted to the propaganda they put out downtown." In halting English, Dr. Castro said, "I admire this. I have seen how it is possible for propaganda to make changes in people. Your people live here and are faced with this propaganda all the time. And yet, they understand. This is very interesting. There are 20 million of us," said Malcolm X, "and we always understand." We spoke with Rosemary Mealy, not only about the meeting between Fidel and Malcolm X, but what it signified.
This infamous meeting between Fidel and Malcolm X, it was not the beginning of the Cuban nation's solidarity between African Americans and the people of Cuba. This encounter really represented a continuation of over 100-year-old history of a solidarity that was born in the enslavement of African people in Cuba and the United States. During the abolitionist movement, there's quite a few black abolitionists who were linked to the struggles the Cuban people were having against Spain. And then later on, in later years, the U.S., there were also ties where during Booker T. Washington's era, we have criticism of Booker T's philosophy, but Black Cubans came to study at Tuskegee Institute. Black women were trained as maids to go back, of course, to work in white Cuban families' homes. Then, when Jose Marti lived in New York, he had ties to black radicals, and that's what I tell people, that the 1960 visit was just a continuum of that history, and the meeting between Fidel and Malcolm solidified those bonds
And what does Fidel's visit to Harlem do to Harlem? How did the Harlemites experience it as they told you?
Well, they told me, it was an acknowledgement, number one, of Black folk in New York, that it was of our reality, our existence. And also the recognition of Harlem at that time was where that was the safest place that Black folk could live. I mean, and it was and when I say Black folk, I'm not just talking about African Americans. There was a large Panamanian community there. There was a large Dominican community, Puerto Ricanos. So for Fidel and the delegation to come to Harlem, it was an acknowledgement that we existed.
This visit from Fidel put Harlem on front pages all over the world. One Harlem resident told a news reporter, quote, "I'm glad Castro came up here to show these people we are somebody." Another was a bit blunter. Quote, "Castro sure made a fool out of them white folks." British historian Simon Hall also wrote a book about the 10 days in Harlem, and in an interview he explained how the U.S. government would often try to keep foreign dignitaries and foreign press out of Harlem, such as the year before all of this in 1959, when Nikita Khrushchev tried to visit the neighborhood.
When Nikita Khrushchev visited the U.S. in 1959, he was really insistent that he wanted to go to Harlem. And he kept on, he wanted to go to Harlem. And eventually his the American minders agree that he can go to Harlem. But they take him then basically like 5 o'clock in the morning on the way to the airport. So he just sort of whizzes through it and there's no one around, because they don't want it to become a kind of a thing, because the last thing the American government wants is to draw attention to its domestic race problem, and particularly to draw attention to its race problem in the North. Because the story the Americans tell is that this is a Southern problem that's being worked out, peacefully and democratically through our constitutional form of government. But it's a Southern problem for historic reasons. What they don't want is people to be looking, and particularly the international spotlight, to fall on the problem of race in one of America's most important northern cities, a city which has a reputation as a kind of bastion of American liberalism.
Castro forged other relationships during this trip. He met with North Korea's Kim Il-sung, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, President of Ghana Kwame Nkrumah, and Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. He also met with the leader of the newly independent Republic of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba, who, as we mentioned earlier in the episode, would soon be assassinated in his country. And that's an important meeting for all kinds of reasons, but one of them was that this was a year and a meeting of the UN at a moment in which so many African nations had kicked out their colonial overlords and become independent. And this was a point made by someone we spoke with, an activist and educator in New York, Joe Kay.
1960 was the year of Africa. That was the year when so many countries became independent of their colonial masters. Lumumba became the most important focal point for these struggles that I've been describing. And not only did he represent a key element of the African liberation movement, but he was also had a much more progressive social outlook and identified with the masses in a way that certain other African leaders who were independence leaders had not. And therefore, he was doubly dangerous and he had to be gotten rid of. Not to mention, of course, that the Congo was the richest country in the world in terms of its natural resources.
Raulito Roa also recalled for us when Fidel met Lumumba. And Fidel also met with Patrice Lumumba, leader of the newly independent Republic of the Congo.
Yes, and Fidel met him and told him we supported this struggle, that it was a just struggle, and that he couldn't count on Cuba's support, and said that he should be careful with the Western countries and with the United States, which were not necessarily in support of changes in the Congo.
Finally, of course, this trip to New York would be where Castro met Khrushchev. One thing you gotta give Khrushchev is his memoirs, at least I find to be very fun to read. Once the Cubans had been browbeaten and then moved to Harlem, he writes, quote, "We were furious when we heard about this swinish behavior toward the Cuban delegation. After consulting with the members of our delegation, I proposed we make a trip to the new hotel and shake Fidel's hand and express our respect and sympathy. No, not sympathy, but indignation." Now, on his journey to Harlem, he writes, Our comrades told me the head of the American police guarding us was asking that I not go there because unpleasant incidents could happen in that neighborhood, and he was talking against this visit in every possible way. That convinced me more than ever of the necessity to make the visit. When we arrived at the hotel, Castro and his comrades were waiting for us by the entrance. This was the first time I had ever seen him in person, and he made a powerful impression on me. A man of great height with a black beard and a pleasant, stern face, which was lit up by a kind of goodness. He bent over me as though covering my body with his. Although my dimensions were somewhat wider, his height overpowered everything. Khrushchev noted with distaste the obvious evidence of the inequalities of America when visiting Harlem, but he was very excited to have met Castro. They only spent 20 minutes together, but Khrushchev and Castro's meeting was, as Simon Hall writes, highly symbolic for practically everyone.
My favorite day, to put it that way, is the 22nd of September, the Thursday, because Eisenhower gives his speech at the General Assembly and then he hosts a lunch for the representatives of Latin America, but he deliberately excludes Fidel. And so Fidel goes back to the Teresa and he treats the employees of the hotel to lunch, to steak and beers, and makes a big show about how he's much more happy to have lunch with the humble people of Harlem than with, the great sort of imperialist Eisenhower.
That was Fidel. That's the Cuban delegation. When they're insulted and pushed to the side, they know who their friends are. So they return back and they set up. They made the luncheon at the Teresa.
All of this was linked together with Fidel. The coming up to Harlem of all the major independence leaders of the Third World. Khrushchev came to the Teresa, and that was quite a symbol of the most powerful leader in the world next to the American president, was paying homage and making a pilgrimage to Harlem. That did not pass unnoticed both by the peoples of Harlem, because Harlem became, for a time, those 10 days, an international capital, the international capital of the world, as it were.
It creates and helps to reinforce this bond of solidarity. And, you see later in the decade, people like Stokely Carmichael or Angela Davis traveling to Cuba. They increasingly view the struggle in broader terms as part of a struggle against imperialism rather than simply as a struggle for kind of civil rights. So I think that this 1960 trip is an important kind of part in the evolution of that wider story of kind of black internationalism and the kind of anti-imperialism of the 1960s.